When you just look at technology alone, the mass use of phones, even I would even say some of the technology that we use with our children as infants, that kind of contribute to imbalanced maturity of how the brain develops. And that really is at the root cause of these symptoms, where we give you the tools to balance the brain, optimize the body, and redefine how to unlock human potential. The Neuronutrition Podcast is sponsored by North Florida Spine and Wellness and produced by Jumine Delmas Studios. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Neuronutrition Podcast, where we give you the tools to balance the brain, optimize the body, and redefine how to unlock human potential. I'm your host, Dr. Z, and today's episode is going to be all about ADHD. But we're not going to be talking about it in the traditional sense, in the traditional definitions that are in the DSM-5. Instead, we are going to be really defining ADHD and the types of ADHD by what is imbalanced in the brain. So if your child, or maybe even yourself, has trouble focusing, maybe you have issues getting motivated, you have brain fog, or maybe you just feel like your brain is in 1,000 places all at the same time, then this episode is for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Neuronutrition Podcast. And let's get started with the show. So the amount of Americans diagnosed with ADHD has really skyrocketed just in the last 20 to 30 years. If you look back even into the late 1990s, it was approximately about 6.1% of children in the United States between the ages of 4 and 17 that had been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, if we look at more current numbers, we're up to about 11.4% and of children the same age, and that equals approximately about 7 million children. Now, the reason for these increased diagnoses are multifaceted. There's undoubtedly more screening, more testing going on to identify children with this diagnosis. But I really believe there's been a lot of environmental factors as well. When you just look at technology alone, the mass use of phones, even I would even say some of the technology that we use with our children as infants, that kind of contribute to imbalanced maturity of how the brain develops. And that really is at the root cause of these symptoms that we see in ADHD. So first, let's talk about the traditional definitions according to the DSM-5. And the DSM-5 essentially has 3 types of ADHD. You have type 1, which is predominantly the inattentive presentation. Then you have type 2, which is the hyperactive impulsive ADHD. And then finally, you have type 3, which is combined, where you have inattentive ADHD and also the hyperactivity and impulsivity. But what's really important to realize is that these diagnoses are not based off any imaging or any type of brain mapping that we look at actually how the brain is regulating. They're really just solely based off symptoms. So what's really important, especially in what we do in the office, in order to treat ADHD, we really have to understand for each patient where the brain is imbalanced. So first, I think it's really important to understand that there are different types of attention, okay? So, for instance, we have sustained attention, and this is controlled mostly by the ventral attention network, which is more lateralized to the right side of the brain. And then we have things like divided attention. So that's being able to filter out all the noise. So this is really what we have in classroom attention. So you're listening to the teacher, you have all the noise going around with you, all the different distractions that you kind of have to filter out. Another great example is if you've ever seen that movie For Love of the Game, when Billy Chapel goes and clears the mechanism to filter out all the crowd noise, to pitch. That is also an example of divided attention. Hyper-focused, detailed attention is another form of attention, and this is more of a left brain skill. And this is going to be more, think about like memorizing. Say if you have to memorize a number real quick, or being able to cram for a test. I never did that, I promise. Or, those are the types of things where we really get locked in. And that's where things like video games can be a detriment. Video games are really designed to hijack that left brain hyper focused attention. You can also see this when we tend to doom scroll on our phones, going through different videos and reels. And I can attest to this when I can be locked in doing that, and my wife is trying to talk to me, and she might try to get my attention 4 or 5 times because I'm so locked in that hyper focused left brain attention. Okay, let's talk about the first type of ADHD that I want to discuss in this kind of brain imbalance context. And that first type is the inattentive ADHD. This is the type of person who kind of has that daydreamer type of symptom profile. And for these individuals, this is typically more of a left hemispheric weakness. The left hemisphere is what's responsible for things like logical organization, sequential thinking, more of a linear type of thought process. It also is involved, like I said earlier, in that real hyper-focused type of attention. And when we see kids or even adults who lack this type of balance in their left hemisphere, then they can look like the type of person, they may have symptoms where they kind of drift off easily, they kind of space out, so to speak. They may have trouble following multi-step instructions. They may seem kind of like they're in their own world. And these types of individuals will often just kind of be thought of as maybe a little bit lazy. Or sometimes, what's interesting is in adults, sometimes I see these types of people who lack energy. They're tired. They'll come in and saying, hey, I think my thyroid is dysfunctioning, or they really feel a physical energy drain. And it's really interesting. I tell this to my patients all the time because, when we see patients, oftentimes fatigue is a very common symptom complaint, especially when I get adults, probably middle age into their 40s and 50s. And really, we have to differentiate between a physical fatigue and a motivational based fatigue. There's our basic energy type of production where you go back to high school biology and we talk about how the cells produce ATP. That is our true physiological energy, and that is regulated by the thyroid. It's regulated by the adrenal glands. There is a lot of physical things and even nutrient deficiencies like B vitamins. But a lot of these folks actually have this type of fatigue where it's truly like they just don't give a crap, okay? They have the lack of motivation to do what they need to do. And for those individuals, it's really more of a brain problem than it is a physiological problem. Now, certainly you could have both of those things going on at the same time. It's not uncalled for that we have weakness in those motivational centers in that left prefrontal cortex, but they also have a B vitamin deficiency. They also have a dysregulated thyroid. These things are not mutually exclusive, but it's important for us to know where to look for these types of imbalances to attack that type of ADHD. The second type we're going to dig into here a little bit is going to be more of that hyperactive ADHD. That is more of a right brain weakness with a left brain dominance. For that right brain, that is what gives us more social awareness. It's more big picture processing. It's more body awareness, being able to feel your body and regulate your body in space. And it also has that impulse control and that orbital frontal cortex where we basically are able to do what we often refer to as go, no go activity. So being able to stop yourself impulsively. And this is the type of ADHD that can really get hijacked with things like excessive screen time, especially scrolling through Facebook or YouTube. Or you can also have this be hijacked by excessive use of things like video games. Because, like we mentioned earlier, that the video games are, literally designed to create this hyper focused type of attention. And now you go play a video game for 15, 20 minutes, even half an hour, that's not going to necessarily create a big problem. But when you're playing these games for hours and hours and hours every single day, that is going to really stimulate and create more hyperactivity in that left brain dominance, which can then override some of the regulation from that right hemisphere and make that type of ADHD significantly worse. So it's really important to know that this hyperactivity isn't like, this kid had too much sugar and has too much energy just in general, even though, certainly the types of foods we eat can um, affect this type of hyperactivity in the left brain. But it's more about not having the proper inhibition. If we think kind of from a 30,000 feet view of what the left brain and right brain do, you really have the left brain, which is really think about that as the gas pedal of the nervous system. And then you have the right brain, which essentially acts as the brake. And so if we're constantly hitting on the gas, okay, and we don't have any brake to us, that really is at the source of this type of ADHD. And then finally, there is a third type of ADHD, and frankly, it's very related to the second type we just talked about, that hyperactive, more impulsive ADHD. And it's what I like to refer to as a sensory motor ADHD. And what I mean by sensory motor ADHD is that it really comes down to an issue in the sensory processing centers. And typically, we more see that on the right hemisphere with ADHD, especially in the parietal lobe, in areas of the brain where we basically create maps of our body. So there's an area of our brain called the homunculus, which essentially maps out our entire body. And what it allows us to do, it allows us to know where all our body parts are in space. And it's really fascinating when you see dysregulation in these areas of the brain. Then we see these kids where really they just don't feel their body in space. And this is part of the reason why they always have to move. You've seen these kids who just cannot stay still. They cannot regulate their body's movement. And that really because they have poor perception of where their body is in space. I just recently have been treating a child, and we, when treating for ADHD, and we started refocusing on these sensory motor areas of the brain. And when we started stimulating more of that right parietal lobe, kind of trying to get those sensory maps, we're starting to see some really cool changes with him. We even saw uh, really cool before and after handwriting. And what was fascinating about this is, you can see this kid uh, trying to, write out some sentences, and the handwriting's terrible. And then we literally put on some transcranial stem on that parietal area, trying to activate those sensory maps of the body. And immediately we see the handwriting change. Now, of course, the goal is to be able to get him to do that without the stimulation. But if we continue to repetitively stimulate that network over and over again, eventually it will become more regulated and more connected, and then it will be more of an automatic response. But that is a great example of where it is very, very important that we're able to identify where the weakness is in the brain to effectively treat all of these types of ADHD. Because if we don't do that, we're just going to be looking at these chemical imbalances. And as we can see, is that this is a reason why a lot of these medications don't always work, or they only work for a short amount of time, usually about 14, 16 months. Most of the research shows, and these medications become ineffective. And that's because the brain chemistry does not regulate the connectivity and regulation of the brain. So going a little bit more into this sensory motor type of ADHD, it's not, we talked about the sensory part, but let's talk about the motor part. When we talk about motor regulation, being able to inhibit movement, that is controlled by the basal ganglia, which is a very primitive part of our nervous system, but it regulates in loops into certain parts of the frontal lobes on the left and the right. And on the left side, especially in the left motor cortex, motor areas of the left hemisphere, that initiates movement. And on the right hemisphere, in that same motor area, supplementary motor area in the motor cortex, that inhibits that movement. So there's this constant battle in your brain to create movement and inhibit movement. And it's going on all the time. And if you have a imbalance in those systems, you're going to be more driven towards movement. And so we can see this with, if you think about the individuals who are always tapping their foot, okay, or perhaps in more severe cases, we may see things like Tourette's, or we may see tics, we may see stims. And a lot of that is driven by that imbalance in those motor areas between the left and right hemispheres. So now it comes down to is, how do we know? How do we identify when a kid comes in with ADHD? How do we identify what type he has? How do we know where we have to target this positive neuroplasticity to balance out these networks? Well, it all starts off with doing a really good neurological exam. And it has to start with the basics. We have to start looking at things like retained primitive reflexes, especially when we talk about ADHD. There's actually two in particular primitive reflexes we see the most. And that was actually shown in I believe it was in 2023. There was a meta-analysis on ADHD in the context of connecting it to retained primitive reflexes. And the two reflexes that we saw the most were the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. So that's doing cross-lateral movements. That's, think about things like crossing the midline. And then you have the symmetric tonic neck reflex, which has a lot to do with creating posture and spinal stabilization and motor control. And those are very important because, as I mentioned, even though, I talk to parents all the time that when they come in and they tell me their child's symptoms, a lot of the symptoms they describe are, we think of frontal lobe type of functions, okay, executive function. And that's true. However, these parts of the brain do not operate in a vacuum. They work with these more primitive, basic parts of the nervous system, like the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is regulated from the top down from these separate frontal lobe areas. And so what's really important, what I'm getting at here, is if we just try to regulate those frontal lobes without doing things like integrating primitive reflexes, which helps build the basal ganglia balance, then we are going to have a hard time really fixing the problem because we're not dealing with the foundation of the nervous system. So looking for retained primitive reflexes is really important. We also want to look at things that help our develop our body maps, like I talked about. So even from a more primitive part, yes, that's looking at how we're processing sensory information, but that's also looking at things like our inner ear balance, our vestibular function. Is there imbalance in our vestibular system? That can be critical in producing proper body awareness. And then also, probably what is now my favorite thing to do in these kids is to do QEEG brain mapping. And when we do that brain mapping, essentially what we're looking for is there excess slow waves? So we have slow waves like delta waves and theta waves that should be more present in sleep and deep meditation. But when we see these brain waves on test when the child is awake or the adult is awake, then we know that that part of the brain is under regulated. It is under firing. I kind of compare it as, think about that part of your brain is asleep when it should be awake. Okay. And then we can compare that to different alpha waves. Okay. Alpha waves are more of our, I kind of dub them our executive functioning brain waves. And so we can kind of look, are there areas that show excess slow waves and a lack of those executive functioning alpha waves? And when we can line that up, and it's really kind of crazy how we will see it lateralized either to the right or to the left in these different areas. I find that a indispensable tool to identify how to very specifically treat these kids, because, like I said, there's a lot of overlap with this kind of sensory motor ADHD and this inattentive and impulsivity ADHD. So it's not uncommon for us to have to attack and stimulate both the right frontal and some more of these sensory processing and motor areas of the brain as well. Like I was made the example of the child we were working on handwriting. We started working with him before we started doing brain mapping, and we were mostly attacking those frontal lobes, integrating the perimeter reflexes, and we saw improvement, but we were kind of starting to hit a plateau. And that's when we kind of backed up and we were able to look at some of this brain mapping and saw these sensory networks. This child just could not feel his body in space. And when you can't feel your body in space, the one way that kind of calms your nervous system is to move. So the movement is actually a type of regulation for these children. So those are really important tools. And, once we know what areas of the brain are underregulated, that's when we can get to creating neuroplasticity. How do we do that? We do that through movement. We do that through physical exercise. But then we use a lot of cool tools. You can use, this is where we can use things like red light therapy. This is where you can use things like neurofeedback to target these specific networks. You can use, another cool tool that we use is direct transcranial stimulation, where we can basically put pads on very specific, what we call Brodmann areas of the brain, and create that neuroplasticity. And usually we do this while they're doing some sort of cognitive task or some sort of movement. And as you do that repetitively, time and time again, then you start getting that wiring. And, it's really cool when you see the wiring change. You stop treating these kids, or you back away from treating these kids, and all of a sudden it doesn't go away. This regulation continues. And so that's really the really, I think, awesome part of what we are able to do with balancing the left and right hemisphere. So I hope this episode was really eye-opening for you. I hope this gave you a better understanding of ADHD and why it can look so different from different kids. And if this is your child, or if this is you as an adult, a lot of people, I think, kind of had the idea that, ADHD was something we could grow out of as we got older, but that's not really true. Honestly, I feel like the symptoms just change. In adults, it can look like more brain fog. It can look more like a form of depression, especially when those motivational centers are going down. It can be anxiety. All those imbalanced networks just change in a symptom profile, especially as adults. So if you'd like some more help trying to figure out what type of ADHD your child may have or you may have, I encourage you to go to melillomethodflorida.com, where you can sign up for a free consultation. And I'll be happy to talk to you and see if we can help you figure out and optimize your attention capabilities. So that's it for this episode of the Neurotrition Podcast. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at Neurotrition Podcast. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.